Okay. All right. Can everybody see that okay? Could somebody give me a thumbs up there? Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Understanding and Supporting Anxious Middle Schoolers. So there's essentially, broadly speaking, two components. We want to do some understanding so that we're in a position of best helping our middle school kids. And full disclosure, I have two kids, and one of them is smack dab in the middle of middle school currently. So for those of you all out there who are watching this live and who will watch this later, I feel your pain personally. The other thing I wanted to mention is just that I may go through these a little bit fast. I'll try not to speed through, but I also want to be sensitive to time, knowing that this is Thursday night after your full day of being at home or being at work and making dinner and doing activities. So I'm going to try and limit this to about 45 minutes if possible, and so we can have maximum time for Q&A at the end. So let's start off with a bird's eye view. What is anxiety? Where does it come from? What can we do about it? In particular, I want to spend the most time there. I want this to feel as practical as possible. I'll touch on some resources, but mostly I'll be giving you resources, and then we'll spend some time in Q&A. And again, if you have any sort of logistical questions that you need addressed more quickly, feel free to chat with Gabrielle, and Gabrielle will decide it if it makes sense to interrupt. For now, I'm not against being interrupted, but generally I like to do the whole presentation so that I have maximum time for your questions. But before we get into what anxiety is, I like to sort of get the lay of the land a little bit with some statistics. And I'm going to start off with some unfortunate statistics, but I want to give you a little bit of hope by the end. So what we know, and this was before the pandemic, that the ratio of girls to boys with anxiety after puberty is much higher. Essentially twice as many girls to boys are being diagnosed with anxiety. And again, this was a pattern that existed before. There are some theories about why this is, but what I think is important just to notice is that by the numbers, our daughters are more vulnerable to this particular diagnosis. And so we may be thinking about, particular ways of supporting them. Since the pandemic, I tried to find as much new data as possible, but, from the large institutions, they're often a couple of years behind. But I found this statistic here, and again, it's unfortunate, but from 2016 to 2020, there was a 29% increase in childhood anxiety. Of course, there were there was increases in behavioral problems, increases in childhood depression as well. But this 29% statistic is pretty high. Now, that doesn't mean that 29% of kids are struggling with an anxiety disorder. Actually, what it is about 9.2, 9.4, I forget, percent of kids are currently diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. But I think all of us can agree that it's too much. They're under such strain that it's just, we need to find targeted ways of helping them. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. And then about a third of kids who have anxiety also qualify for a diagnosis of depression. And I include that there just because anxiety is one of those conditions, or clinical anxiety disorder is one of those conditions that has high comorbidity, meaning there's a high likelihood that other things are going wrong as well too. And in part because when a child is going through cycles of anxiety and avoidance, they can create for themselves a more and more limited life, and they get less and less of the benefit of everyday living, of interacting with friends, of interacting with teachers and mentors and coaches and that sort of thing. So anxiety over time, really, it generally needs intervention. It generally doesn't get better on its own, unfortunately, and it can turn into other things as well. But I do want to give you a little bit of hope. In preparing for this presentation, I learned that 85% of parents said their kids from 2019 to 2020 that even though their kids were getting telehealth, which is not a traditional modality for helping kids of this age, we all, as therapists, we all had to learn how to do it when we essentially went into lockdown and isolation. Even with telehealth, parents are reporting that it's helping their kids. So there's reason for hope. So let's talk about anxiety, what it is. I want to start with normative anxiety. So normative anxiety means that we all have it, and it's understandable. We need it. This is part of our evolved sense of safety. We get an alarm in our brain, and it tells us there's either danger or uncertainty in our environment that we need to attend to. And in that way, it energizes us. So we need it to stay alive. So not all anxiety is bad. And what it does, even when we're talking about normative anxiety, when we feel anxiety coming on, it's beginning to trigger our fight, flight, and freeze responses. But again, this is good. What we want to make sure is that it's not becoming persistent, and it's not happening when we don't need it to happen, when there's literally no danger to be responding to. And so again, normative anxiety, we can experience it as worry, fear, panic. That makes sense. But with kids, sometimes you see things that don't quite look like anxiety on the surface, like irritability and anger. And if you're the parent of an anxious kid, you've undoubtedly experienced their anxiety manifesting through physical symptoms like queasiness or stomach ache or headache. And it's these kinds of symptoms, these normal anxiety symptoms, on steroids when we're at the point of diagnosing it as a clinical anxiety or an anxiety disorder. So how do you determine which is which? What level of severity is? Well, the simple thing that we do, and of course this isn't a full assessment or even a full screening, but one tool that you can use as a parent is to think about how persistent over time are these symptoms that I'm seeing in my child? How pervasive are they? Meaning, do they occur in all aspects or more than one aspect of the child's life, for example, home and school? And the symptoms are severe enough that it just makes normal living difficult. And what we see generally with anxious kids or kids who are plagued by a lot of anxiety is that their life, as I mentioned before, becomes more and more restricted. So a couple of types of clinical anxiety I just want to touch on briefly. Specific phobias, these are like phobias of spiders or dogs. These are things that are very targeted that the child has an irrational and exorbitant fear of. And they'll get triggered. They can get triggered by their fears, even in sometimes bringing these objects to mind. With social phobia, so specific phobia and separation anxiety is kind of self-explanatory. We see it a lot normatively with 1 to 3 year olds, where they're not inclined to explore, or they only explore under very kind of rigid circumstances. They like to stay close to their mom or dad. So separation anxiety can be normal, but it can also be clinical. And we see specific phobias and separation anxiety generally earlier on the developmental continuum when kids are younger, essentially. And we start to see more social phobia or social anxiety coming online around the middle school and adolescent years. And there's other categories too. Panic, we all know what panic is. And generalized anxiety is kind of a worry that just kind of stays with you. So you're worried about essentially all of or most of the aspects of your life. Now, I always like to talk about, when we're talking about what is anxiety, I like to talk about the 3 or maybe 4 components of that are overlapping here. So our kids can have, and us too, of course, if we're struggling with anxiety, we have anxious thoughts, which can become anxious beliefs. Of course, we experience anxiety as feelings, both emotions and sensations in our body, as I referred to earlier. But then there are particular behaviors that will often go along with anxiety. and I'll explain that soon, that really have to do with they're more or less coping behaviors that kids will invent on their own in order to diminish the impact of their anxious discomfort. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of defining and describing anxiety is this process called the anxiety avoidance cycle. And this is definitely not something I invented, but it's so common to kids with anxiety, but it's sometimes as a parent really hard to see because it plays on our natural desire to protect and nurture our kids. So let's imagine an example. Your seventh grader had some issue at school. Let's say you're not aware of the issue, but they come home. In reality, what happened was they had some conflict with their friend group. Let's say their best friend. They come home, they're kind of sullen, withdrawn, don't really want to eat much, go to bed early. You don't know what it is, but you figure it'll work itself out on its own. And your child wakes up in the morning and remembers what happened at lunch the day before, and it triggers an anxious feeling. And she starts, or an anxious thought, it could be anxious thought or anxious feeling, just recalling the conflict that they had, which is not common for your daughter and her friend, let's say. And so what happens is she starts to feel a stomach ache while she's laying in bed in the morning, wakes up. You go in, say, hey, why aren't you getting ready to school? And she says, my stomach hurts, I don't feel good. You give her a COVID test, it's negative, but you think, well, I doubt she's faking it. Let me give her a rest day. And so then what happens is she's now able to escape from that anxiety-inducing stimulus, right? And, so far what I've described isn't crazy. This is, I think, from any perspective, or almost any perspective, this is just a basic, loving, protective thing that a parent might do, to be flexible with their child who needs a little bit of relief. But when that happens, and I'm not saying you can never do this, this is just part of a cycle that's repeated over and over again with kids who have anxiety. So your daughter she avoids the anxiety causing stimulus and then gets immediate relief. It feels good because she knows she doesn't have to go face her friend and work out, their little conflict. But the problem is that relief is temporary. What's going to happen is that avoidance or that escape process is reinforced, meaning it's more likely to happen again in the future. And that will, over many cycles of this, will strengthen the anxiety, will strengthen this cycle itself. And it will it'll totally limit the potential resilience that the child could get from facing this fear of confronting or working on this interpersonal issue with her best friend. And the thing to know about this is that this can start early in life, because again, we go back to the toddler example. Toddlers are always kind of wrapping us into helping them feel safe. And of course, we need to do that. But we do also need to make sure that our kids are getting challenges through the developmental spectrum. And so getting wrapped up, again, it intersects perfectly with our desire to nurture and protect. So that's why sometimes when kids come to our clinic here, the parents are not even aware that they're in some ways contributing to this anxiety avoidance cycle, just because they are being good parents. But what we'll see later is that we need some new behaviors to ensure that the child's getting enough challenges and moving away from the vulnerability that's created with the anxiety avoidance cycle and towards a greater sense of emotional resilience. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about some potential sources. I believe in the outline it's mentioned contributors to anxiety, but I want to make a statement about this first, because a lot of this stuff is supported by research, but a lot of this research in this area is correlational. It's not causational. We can't randomly assign kids and families to different conditions where you subject them to particular kinds of parenting styles. We can't really run experiments. And so when you're looking at these factors, just think about them as things to reflect on in your own life. Some will be relevant and some won't. So first one, obviously, to think about is genes. And we know from research that kids who have anxiety are significantly more likely to have a parent with anxiety than are kids who do not have anxiety. And just in terms of biology, what's happening when our fight, flight, and freeze response is getting triggered by anxiety? It's this little part in our brain called the amygdala. It's like the shape of an almond, the size of an almond. And it's kind of scanning the environment for danger and uncertainty and unpredictability. And in kids with anxiety, that alarm is going off more frequently and more intensely. And so part of what we're actually doing is helping the child engage their prefrontal cortex, this front part of their brain, which unfortunately is not developed and won't really completely develop until their mid-20s, but getting this prefrontal cortex engaged so that they can more thoughtfully look at a situation that's causing them anxiety and make choices about how to calm their amygdala and calm their bodies, and then still step up to whatever the challenge is. And there's some evidence that certain styles of child-parent interaction is also associated with the development of childhood anxiety. But please, again, don't take this as researchers judging you. This is just something that has been seen to be correlated. And if it's true in your family, maybe it's something that you can reflect on to see that could be helpful to change. So it could be that anxiety is sort of built up in the child over time if parents are routinely removing obstacles from them and protecting them too much so that they don't get enough kind of regular experience and challenges in their day-to-day, in their relationships, in school, in their community. And so that's one way that anxiety that could potentially contribute to anxiety. But another way too is that how we cope with our own anxiety, and every parent has some anxiety, some have diagnosable anxiety, how we cope with our anxiety provides a model for our kids. And it's amazing. I think, I've been doing therapy for a long time. I had my own therapy as part of my training, and I still forget that my kids are watching me all the time. So how I handle things and how I show them how I'm handling things, stressors and anxiety really matters. And this one is a huge category, and we could do a whole presentation on this. Our kids have the crisis of the day at their fingertips if they have a phone or if they have a tablet, which many kids in middle school do. And in general, from a mental health perspective, this is not a moral perspective, this is not a judgment. From a mental health perspective, these things, these phones and tablets and sometimes computers and that have access to social media, in particular, that have access to pornography, that have easy access to scenes that really, as parents, we would hope to be able to filter out. It's just so easy for a child to get overwhelmed. And I don't know the research. I didn't delve into that for this presentation. I don't know the research on how technology interacts with anxiety, but I can tell you anecdotally from experience that it can really complicate the picture for kids who are already isolating or withdrawing, or who are not meeting the challenges of kind of typical life. A couple other potential sources. Again, there's research that shows that certain life events like trauma, and of course, we've got a lot of proof of this now, that the pandemic it's creating vulnerability in our kids, and it's causing anxiety. And one of the main reasons is because in the pandemic, our kids have been severely isolated. Many have a lot more connection and contact with their peers and their community again. But I think for some children, a particular subset, they accrued some wounding, some emotional wounding over the last 2 years, and even returning to somewhat, as much as they have, returning to normal life hasn't fully helped them regain a sense of resilience. And there's, of course, developmental factors as well. So many kids in middle school are going through puberty. And as part of a typical developmental trajectory, they're turning a lot more towards their peers for interaction, for guidance, for values. And we know that that their social life is getting more complicated, and in part because they're starting to be romantically interested in other kids. And so what we're doing then, not we, it's what life is doing, is piling on stressors that they have to contend with. And another thing from the research literature is that kids who have a history of anxiety, for example, separation anxiety when they're younger, will tend to have higher rates of anxiety when they hit the middle school years. And the last thing to talk about from the research is that a certain temperament is associated with higher rates of anxiety. And this is called behavioral inhibition in the research literature. You can also just call it shyness. And so these are the kids that you might call when they're 2, 3, and 4 years old. They're kind of slow to warm up. They're not the kids who's going to run up and embrace even a safe stranger. They're going to take their time. They're going to stay close to mom or dad's leg, and they're going to scan and look around before they're able to feel safe and their emotions are regulated in the presence of a new person. And so those kids, for reasons that I don't think we totally understand yet, those kids are more likely to develop an anxiety disorder when they're a little older. Let's see. Oh, here's a slide. Okay, so now I want to transition. This is to the kind of steak and potatoes here, the meat and bones. This is our kind of bird's eye view of what can we do to help our kids. And where we start on the left-hand side there is with an acronym that I call REFS. So that stands for, this is kind of how I see the fundamentals of self-care, or at least the quadrants of self-care that all of us need as individuals, and that can be challenging, especially at this stage of development for middle schoolers. So it stands for relationships, exercise, food, sleep, and spirituality. Now, I see this as kind of upstream, as kind of foundational for the kinds of things that we can help our kids with, leading to improved anxiety. But for a child who has high levels of anxiety, even when all of these refs are operating well, I mean, of course it helps. And there's some research in particular on exercise and sleep that when those things are going well, you tend to see less anxiety. And you can think about one study I looked at showed that exercise as an adjunct to therapy was particularly effective in minimizing anxiety. But all of these things being more or less good still doesn't necessarily reduce anxiety or improve tolerance for it. That's why we want to get into some additional, what I'm calling targeted supports. And I'll talk about each of these in the following slides. So those include workbooks written by psychologists and therapists. Of course, it includes therapy for some kids. And then what I use in particular, we're very thoughtful here in the clinic about the physiological side of anxiety. So we talk a lot about and do exercises around body regulation, helping kids feel good in their bodies. And the next one, PC and MS, I'll explain that later. That's just an abbreviation for a model by a psychiatrist named Bruce Perry, which dovetails really well with this other model, a visual model that I want to show you called the anxiety engagement cycle. And so ultimately what we're trying to do with having our basic self-care in place and having these targeted, whatever combination of targeted supports works for your family and your child, we're of course looking to reduce their anxiety. But another thing that I think often gets overlooked is that even when kids, it's a victory even if a child's anxiety doesn't diminish that much with these efforts, but their capacity for tolerating the anxiety improves, then that is a big win. So what we might, if we go back to that example, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, of the let's say 13-year-old, the middle school daughter who is avoiding going to school. If she goes to school and finds out that, either her friend forgot about the issue or they have a chance to work it out, she may experience quite a bit of anxiety going into that moment. And so the first part of her day leading up to lunch may be really uncomfortable. But the fact that she goes through it shows her that she actually can tolerate these moments, even when she's uncomfortable. And that is a big victory. And I think of the third kind of goal, showing improved anxiety, is that our kids learn to use their anxiety better. Because what happens most often is they come to believe that whatever the anxiety-inducing stimulus is, a test, a competition, a performance that they have to do. If they come to believe and convince themselves that it's too much for them, then they're not able to use the energy that is naturally created by an anxious feeling. And so we want to get to a place where they can make better use of their anxiety. So rather than being, huddled up in the bed, anxious about a test, we're actually cracking open the book and using that energy to study. So working through anxiety. Now, this is kind of the opposite of what I was explaining before, the anxiety avoidance cycle. And let's tell it through the example of your middle school daughter, or our middle school daughter. So same thing. We're going to repeat the first part. She had a dust up with her friend. She's struggling when she gets home, but this time parents are able to talk with her about it, and they have a bit of an open dialogue, so they have a sense of what's going on. And they talk about it a little at night. Child still kind of upset by it, goes to sleep, wakes up in the morning with the stomach ache. I don't want to go. COVID test is negative. And the parental response this time is, I know you're really struggling with this. I know your body feels uncomfortable, but I know you can get through this. I know you can go to school, and I'm looking forward to you telling me how it goes when you solve this problem with your friend. So the parent does not let her stay home in this example, and instead politely but firmly, supportively pushes her to rise to the occasion. So what happens is then, in this example, it could happen a number of ways. Again, we talked about before, the anxiety is high, but she has a chance to be in the presence of her friend. And whether they work it out or not, maybe they do work it out, or maybe things are just fine. Either way, there's a good chance that that's going to disconfirm her fear about how catastrophic the conflict was with her best friend. And so it gives her a chance to get calm in the presence of the thing that scared her. And what we see, instead of temporary relief that leads to long-term strengthened anxiety, we get actual reduction in anxiety and or an increase in the tolerance for it. This is essentially one version of what I would call a resilient cycle. So, and I say all this, this is just a visual model, but this is the kind of thing that can guide, it can guide you in, you can come up with specific ways using this idea to interact with your kid, to hold them accountable, to be supportive, but also make sure that they're getting some appropriate challenges. And you can do that in your own kind of manner, in your own kind of way. Now, let's talk about a couple of other targeted supports: workbooks and self-calming. So workbooks, this is yet another way of engaging the anxiety directly. Sometimes what we talk about is ways that we handle stress, ways that we handle anxiety, ways that we handle suffering broadly. Is we can either lean in to the anxiety, or we can lean out. So leaning out is what most of us do most of the time. It's kind of distracting ourselves from it. And that has a place, But the thing that helps us counter the anxiety most forcefully and most consistently, most reliably, is when we lean in or engage the anxiety. And these workbooks, which were definitely not around when I was a kid, can be very helpful in that. And these are the titles of this. This is also going to be on your resource list that Gabrielle will put in the chat soon with the authors' names on it. But these are books that I've used with kids who I felt it was appropriate for. And a lot of the exercises that are in these books are drawn from a form of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which has been shown to be very effective for kids and adolescents who are anxious. It's not the only form of treating kids with anxiety, but it does have a lot of great, straightforward applications, and I'll talk more about those soon. And then, of course, you read a blog on childhood anxiety, you talk to a pediatrician about it. Everybody knows that when you're anxious, you should work on being calm. The problem is that we often don't experiment enough with it, even adults ourselves. We don't try it with enough fervor. For example, breathing exercises. This is something that I both love and know doesn't work with everybody, especially the younger kids, because it requires a bunch of their prefrontal cortex to actually remember to do these kinds of things. But if you give this a good, committed try, and you can do this with your kids too, to actually teach them some of these skills, it can be helpful in the moment when they're starting to experience panic. And so just real briefly, there's many different kinds of breathing exercise. There's what's called the belly breath, where you're imagining you're breathing into your belly and engaging your diaphragm more. There's the 4-8 breath, which is where you inhale for 4 and exhale for 8. And there's my favorite, which is has a funny name. It's called the physiological sigh. I call it the 21 breath because it's a double inhalation and a longer exhalation. And I have a YouTube video about it on our Family Spring YouTube channel. It lasts all of 1 minute, but I got it from a neurobiologist named Andrew Huberman, who's at Stanford. And it essentially goes like this. So the idea there is you're supersaturating your alveoli in your lungs, and you're accentuating the exhale. And when you exhale longer than you inhale, you're activating a part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which engages all of your relaxation. And over time, there's a little lag in it, it even can slow your heart rate down a bit. But again, with most breathing exercises, you really need to repeat it. So just trying it for a couple of breaths tends to not work. And this is one of those examples where the modeling can go a long way, because if you're trying to tell your kid, well, hey, if you're stressed, just focus on your breathing, it carries a lot more weight. There's a lot more oomph to it when they actually see you doing it as well. And on this theme of finding ways to self-calm, helping our kids self-calm, there's many different ways of doing it, and you probably have at least 1 or 2 ideas for your own kid. It can be simple things like listening to music or dancing or exercising. And I included, Gabrielle will post a worksheet that I created for you all that you can use to take some of these concepts, take some of these exercise, and put them into practice. Ideally with your partner or spouse, but if that's not possible, you can do it on your own. And choosing what you would like to experiment with for yourself, for your own self-calming, and then teaching your middle schooler as well. A couple of other targeted supports that I found useful with my kids, working with kids and families, is to have a regular dialogue about our brains, maybe even teaching them about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, about the body, of course. What are the sensations that they're feeling in their body when they're having fun, when they're doing well, and also when they're feeling anxious. And just generally having an open dialogue about our emotional life. What that does is it implicitly communicates to the child not only that you value that part of their existence, but that when they need our help to work through some of this anxiety, that we're actually there for them, and they don't have to hide it from us. And coming back to CBT, to cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a concept of cognitive errors that I have found really useful. This is not something I use so much with younger kids, but middle schoolers have the intellectual capacity to take this on. So there are certain thoughts, if you remember, are those three circles, that kind of Venn diagram with the overlapping circles. There was one that talked about thoughts / beliefs. And these kinds of things, we call them cognitive errors. They can both exacerbate anxiety, and they can also be a result of anxiety or stress. And one of the ones I talk with kids about, to kids and parents, is all or nothing thinking. And, an example of all or nothing thinking is in our middle schooler who wanted to avoid confronting or seeing her best friend again, is she might say, if she sees me, we're going to get into a fight and I won't have a best friend. So I have to just stay home to avoid it. So all or nothing. And related to that is my favorite. This is called catastrophizing. I introduced this to my 7th grader, to my child recently, and she really liked the idea, because it's obvious what it is, thinking about the worst case scenario and having that be what's in the front of their minds. This is the thing that's really the most believable. That's what they convince themselves of. And I think the reason why my daughter was able to take on and be curious about this idea of catastrophizing is because I brought it up in a moment where she wasn't upset. So I've heard this idea of striking while the iron is cold. So not during heated, charged moments, not when your kids are being defiant or they're upset with you. When you're in a place where things are looser, you're feeling connected, and you can play with ideas together. And then the last one that I think is really important, there's plenty more cognitive errors, and you can Google, I'm sorry, I didn't put together a PDF for you about this, but you can Google cognitive errors PDF and you can download it, no problem. You'll get a sheet and a half of vocabulary. But this other one, mind reading, is particularly important for kids who are starting to move towards a social anxiety. An example that I had was I was working with an adolescent a while back, and there was one time where he was walking through school, and he was in a big public school, and he bent over to tie a shoelace. And as he was doing that, he noticed that a couple of kids were watching him. And he didn't anticipate it, but he felt embarrassed and he felt uncomfortable, in part because what he thought they were communicating with that looks is that he thought that they were judging him. He thought that they were thinking he was weird or foolish for having been kind of, a bigger kid and not having his shoelaces tied. So what happened from that one incident is that he really wanted to avoid the hallway, which is totally impractical, right? You have to go in the hallways to go to your different classes. I mean, the good news is we were able to work on that. And he picked up on this idea of mind reading too, because he realized that it wasn't quite rational what he was thinking, that he was kind of putting on these kind of negative attributions for these other kids who were just looking at him. Now, this is a model that comes from Dr. Bruce Perry, well-known psychiatrist from Houston. I went to a training of his out here in 2015. And what I loved about his presentation was that he had a lot of visual models, which have a special place in my heart, and because it helps me remember better. And one of the kind of surprising things that he talked about is, for me anyways, is how stress essentially has two paths. And this was his summary of a lot of the research on stress and, mental health challenges writ large, including depression, including behavioral issues, including anxiety. And one of the paths of stress is towards greater emotional vulnerability. And stress becomes emotional vulnerability when it is experienced as unpredictable, uncontrollable, and high stress. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because we don't have a sense of agency when we're just stuck with high stress. And kids can feel that in response to a teacher's demands. Let's say you have a strict or demanding teacher with high expectations. That can contribute, not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but that can contribute to a child's sense of stress as being high, and it can elicit a greater sense of vulnerability. And vulnerability, emotional vulnerability, I'm talking about broadly, right? Can include anxiety, can include low self-esteem, low self-confidence, that sort of thing. And I'll tell you the part that surprised me about this model, because all of that makes intuitive sense to me. What I didn't realize is that stress can actually become resilience, of course, when it's felt to be predictable and controllable, but when stress is moderate, where I was expecting, I thought it was going to be a total opposite, where when stress is low, that helps to develop resilience. But Dr. Perry's read of the literature was that kids actually need some stress. They need some stress stress is like kind of the fuel for developing resilience. So we need to ensure that our kids are getting regular challenges every day. I listened to a presentation from another psychologist recently, and her idea was, make sure your kids are doing something hard every day. And this is a targeted way. It's a way of shifting some of how we live our daily lives to ensure that our kids are getting those reps. And it can be simple things. It could be things like having them responsible for a chore, could be making sure that they feel comfortable walking to the store on their own, or walking with their friends to a store or to the movies if it's not too far away, giving them that sense of like, you can do this independently. You can step up to these stressful challenges and kind of feel more mature and feel more capable. The last thing I want to say before we get into resources and then into Q&A is a consideration of when to seek treatment, because some of you who are watching this either now or in the recording may be wondering, but I still don't know if it's severe enough. I still don't know if my kid really needs to talk to a therapist or to get medication. So what I always tell parents is to come back, reflect on those three adjectives: persistent, pervasive, and severe. Does it regularly limit, constrict, harm their normal function, their normal life? And one of the most common things I get is parents will call us at the clinic and they say, well, I think my kid needs therapy, but I don't know if this is just typical adolescent individuation and wanting to be independent and thinking parents are mean and unreasonable and lame. So I always direct them. I mean, one of the things I do is actually get the details, but in particular, I'm looking to see if their symptoms they're having are persistent, pervasive, and severe. And it's an unfortunate truth. And again, this data comes from before the pandemic. I don't expect that it would have changed necessarily, but about 80% of kids who have depression get treatment. You could argue that that's kind of low. You would hope, of course, that something closer to 100% would be the reality. Kids with depression are getting the help they need. But for whatever reason that I don't quite understand, only 60% of kids with anxiety are getting treatment. And that is really unfortunate. So what I encourage parents to do is to, use your parental intuition, use your reflection, talk about it with your partner or spouse. And if you're still unsure, err on the side of caution. What we do at our clinic is we have a step-by-step process so that that we do these, we kind of build up to it gradually. the first thing we do, and this is common in the field, in the industry anyway, is we do an initial free 15 or 20-minute call. And so sometimes the parents will say, my kid's struggling with X, Y, and Z. What do you think? And my answer to that usually is like, well, I think it's worth meeting with the therapist. If these concerns are really creating some worry in you. And so they'll have an initial session with one of our therapists, that the parents will, where they can kind of delve into it more deeply. And again, we're not the only ones who do this. This is fairly standard. And then at the end of that session, it's another decision point. Well, should we do a mental health assessment? And this is a semi-formal process where we're just kind of figure out what's going on with the kid. Not only do they have anxiety, certainly we can diagnose them, but what's the entire picture of their life that we need to know to help them move forward? And then we do 4 to 6 sessions where we're doing that assessment. We're meeting with the kids. Sometimes we're talking with other important adults in their lives, and we're sort of exploring their mind together and building that relationship with them. And then we have a feedback session at the end of those 4 to 6 sessions. And this is when we're sharing our impressions. If it's necessary for a diagnosis, this is when we diagnose the child. And this is when we're proposing, here's what I think should happen. Here are our 1 to 3 therapy goals, and here's how I think we could get there together. Or we may find at that time, you know what, I don't think your child really meets these criteria. Why don't we do this? Why don't you take these workbooks, try some exercises over the next 3 months? Let's check in, have another call, and see if that's been helpful enough. So the reason why I'm describing all these details, this sequence, is that you don't have to commit to everything. And this is true for us, and this is true for other places as well. You can just take a small step to try and get a professional to help you make that determination. So I encourage you to do that if that feels right for your family. Now, if you wouldn't mind, Gabrielle, would you add some of those 3 PDFs into the chat? And I just put a couple of them here. One of the PDFs is, there's 3 documents. One is the worksheet that I mentioned before, and attached to that worksheet is a resource list. And these are some of the items on the resource list. If you have questions about your anxiety, if you have questions about your child's anxiety, these are some good resources for you. These top 2, anxiety.org and the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. They have a therapist directory that you can look through. You can also look at Psychology Today. Of course, that's the biggest therapist directory in the country, as far as I know. But they also have groups, peer-to-peer support groups. I believe they have them for adults. I didn't see that they had it for kids, but that can be helpful for adults as well. And then in particular, in response to the school shooting in Uvalde, I wanted to include my favorite trauma resource for families. It's called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And if you go there, they just have a ton of resources. And 2 of the PDFs that Gabrielle is going to add to the chat are 2 resources from NCTSN specifically about how to talk with your kids about shootings. One is more broad about shootings in general. It's a little shorter. And then one is about school shootings. That one is targeted for people who have been through the school shooting. And fortunately, you all have not been through that. But there's still both. There's a lot of overlap between the 2, but they're still both worth looking at, and both could be very applicable to the questions that your children may have come home with already. And then this other resource, the Child Mind Institute. They're great. Their content is great for general mental health things, including anxiety. So now I believe I'm going to stop sharing it because it is time for Q&A. All right.
And what I will do is I will still give you spotlight you.
Yeah, no problem.
And for those of you, you are welcome to leave any questions you have for Dr. Mica at our chat room. Okay, call you Mica, okay. I have we have some questions for you. You mentioned earlier that anxieties often comes hand in hand with depressions.
Yeah.
Do I get it right? Would you elaborate more about that?
Well, what we see most often, and this is not true for every kid with anxiety, I think the statistic there was about a third of kids who have an anxiety diagnosis also would qualify for an additional diagnosis of depression. And the path that I'm familiar with is where a child starts to develop some anxiety early, and they engage a lot in this anxiety avoidance, chronically. And, even a 12, 13-year-old, even as young as they are, they can have hundreds or more repetitions of avoidance. And sometimes the avoidance is very subtle. Sometimes it's not as obvious, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily recruit the parent. And so as they do that, they're becoming less and less resilient over time. And as I mentioned before, their life becomes more and more constricted. And so when their life is constricted, they're missing out on opportunities for esteem. They're missing out on opportunities for positive social experiences. They're missing out on meeting and overcoming challenges. And all of those things can potentiate or contribute to the development of a depression. So the model that I'm familiar with is anxiety first, developing into an additional depression. But I suspect that it can go the other direction too, with depression, in similar ways, in the sense that depression can create a constriction of living more broadly, and kids missing out on these developmentally appropriate, empowering experiences that happen on a regular basis. I think about my fourth grader. One of the things that he loves to do is he plays basketball at lunch, and this is a new thing that he started with his friends this year, and I just see his confidence just blooming. I think there's probably some other developmental things going on there too, but a lot of it is just because he's playing with his friends. He's learning new sport. He's having some success with it. And kids who are depressed or anxious are more likely to miss out on those things.
Thank you. Now, how do you assess whether a child actually needs medication or even seek help from a psychiatrist?
Yes, great question. And I'll give you a really poor answer, and then I'll try and give you a better one. So first, the bad answer is I don't assess if a kid needs medication, because I'm a psychologist and I don't deal with medicine. I'm not a physician. Pediatricians, for middle schoolers, it's pediatricians and psychiatrists typically. And the circumstance where I would direct parents to seek out a consultation with a child psychiatrist is if the treatment is not helping, if it doesn't seem to be working fast enough, or sustainably enough over time to see that reduction in anxiety, or to see that increased tolerance for the anxiety. The other situation where I might encourage parents to seek that consultation is if it's intense already, and say, for example, the kid is refusing to go to school and it's having some, and the school's not able or willing to work with the family to get the child back in, and there's a real urgency around it, then I might consider that. But I haven't been in that position yet, and that may just be from lack of experience. But the thing is, with the first line anxiety medications, they tend to need time to build up in the child's system. So it's not always an immediate thing. So I hope that helps. But the research on using medication for reducing anxiety symptoms is good. It tends to help. So does straight therapy and even more so therapy plus medication. But that's, that's an individual decision for each family. I've heard psychologists also poo-poo medication for anxiety just because the child, because they see it as just treating the symptoms and not getting to the root cause of some of those physiological responses, some of those cognitive processes and beliefs that generate that consistent anxiety. I'm agnostic about it. I just want kids to feel good, and they can do that by various means.
Someone commented that thank you for the wonderful presentation. And the question is, what is the best approach to talk to your children about the shooting?
About the shooting?
Yeah.
Well, so again, I'll give I'll give a cheap answer and then hopefully a more valuable answer. First answer is look at those PDFs. That is, one of them is actually entitled like guidelines for talking with kids and teens about the school shooting. But what I generally recommend to parents when they're talking about these very intense and overwhelming and just difficult situations is first communicate your openness to talking about it. And so you might start with some questions, but don't overwhelm them with questions. First, ask what they know. So rather than saying, was that scary for you? Starting off there, of course, you can ask that once things are going. Finding out what they know, because a lot of kids, in fact, this just happened the other day for me, yesterday. My kids were listening to the radio in the morning, and I hadn't told them yet about it. And in fact, I didn't even find out about it until you emailed me the night before, Gabrielle. I didn't know about it. And so I hadn't yet talked with my kids about it, but they were listening to the radio, and there's a radio station that my kids listen to called 99.7 now, because it plays pop music here in the Bay Area. And they have a segment in the morning called Dirty on the 30. And it's like gossip stuff. Yeah, I'm ambivalent. I'll admit I'm ambivalent about my kids listening to that, but they heard about the shooting that way. And to me, and we were able to talk about it then, which was good. It was actually a good opportunity. But what that's emblematic of is that our kids, we really can't filter out overwhelming stuff in this generation of parenting like we could in previous generations of parenting, because it's just, and that was, and I'm talking about old technology. I'm just talking about the radio. It's even more likely if my kids had phones, they probably would have found out immediately. So assume that they know something, ask them about it, communicate in openness, know that it's probably not going to be just one conversation. And if they're not able, if it's too overwhelming for them in one conversation, you can gently check in with them at another time. What I hear a lot is sometimes when parents are having difficult conversations with kids, they'll ask them about it kind of nervously, and then the kid will, give a meek response. And then the parent will say something like, well, you can always talk to me about it. Or let's say the kid starts to actually get into it. And then the parent tries to reassure, again, a great intention. They try and reassure the kid, like, you can always talk to me about this stuff. You're actually the kid will often experience that as a parent stepping away and saying like, okay, we're good here. I know I can check with you generally, when you're actually already in the dialogue.
Present moment.
What's that?
That present moment that
Yeah.
they want us seeking dialogue.
Yeah. And, again, this is all of the things that help with talking about horrific things like school shootings is all of the things that go along with just um, emotionally intelligent communication, doing more listening than talking, expressing curiosity, reading how your words impact their face and their body, um, and and encouraging them to ask you questions. One of the things that helps with the anxiety the spike in anxiety and fear that can come from these sorts of events is kids asking you questions and you all thinking about actions that you can take together, right? And so maybe that looks like you're talking with the school to find out, well, what are the safety policies? And you can communicate that to the kid, or you can encourage the kid to talk with the teachers and school officials, or reflect on some of the things that they already do. Because out here in some school districts, we do active shooter drills, we do emergency drills. And so kids have some familiarity with this, but they might not necessarily make the connection that there are things that the adults are doing to ensure that they're safe. And because anxiety thrives in darkness, in silence, and in isolation, working against all of those things should be helpful to help your kids get through what should be a temporary. And this is one of the things it talks about in the PDFs from NCTSN. These changes in appetite, changes in sleep, changes in relationships and energy, they should be temporary.
So what you mentioned, what you're saying is how the parents talk and communicate with the child is really important. And many of us actually grew up in a really different way of parenting, how our parents parenting us, and the new generation really approaching it differently. Will you have any suggestion how do we learn to nowadays parents how to learn to communicate with our kids, which is really different than how we grow up?
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I think you're pointing to a big challenge that that most of us experience when we become parents, which is that depending on our upbringings, our culture, our background, we might actually want to parent fairly differently than our parents parented us. And so we might be doing things as parents that our parents never did or never tried. For example, we might be trying to have an open dialogue about emotions, which, many, as you know, Gabrielle, I'm sure many kids of our generation did not have that with their parents. And so asking parents to do that now is like, yeah, that's a heavy lift. If you don't have that in your bones, you don't have anybody who modeled that for you with repetition when you're a kid, it is harder. But I think there's kind of a few principles, and it is kind of returning again to this emotionally intelligent communication. One is to try and work on being calm yourself. It's good, and accept that when you're doing these new behaviors, even if you're an adult, don't expect that it's going to work out great the first time or the second time or the third time. Give yourself some space to make mistakes. And one of the things that helps too is kind of going slow. So allow for mistakes, go slow, be curious, listen more than you talk. And once you get going with your kid, then it becomes a conversation, and everybody can have a conversation. And you'll see that the kid will often do some of the heavy lifting as well. What I would caution parents against, because coming back to how we were parented, we all have kind of innate and reflexive ways of responding to stress. And so our tendency is to go, when we're stressed, our tendency is to go into those modes of communication that were familiar to us from when we were young, because they're neurologically, they're easy. They come quickly. They come quickly to our minds. And that's why I talk about trying to be calm when you're having these conversations. And that should help prevent the minimization. Sometimes when we reassure our kids, when we're trying to reassure our kids, when we reassure them too early, it can be experienced as minimizing or denying or otherwise not valuing and validating whatever their authentic experience is. And I generally, when I'm talking about discipline with parents, I try and help them. This applies to just communication in general. I try and help them distinguish between the feelings and the behavior. So with our kids, one thing that helps them continue to rely on us as kind of emotional coaches throughout their development is if we are consistently supporting and validating their feelings, even if we disagree with the feelings. And so the feelings are always okay with us as parents, but the behaviors are not necessarily always okay. And so the corrections are directed at the behaviors that the child is engaging. So for example, sometimes when kids are anxious, they start to engage in some risky behaviors, even in middle school, start maybe drinking or smoking or vaping or doing risky sorts of things. Those are things that need limits immediately. But the feelings underlying them are not to be judged, because the kids need a place to house those feelings. And as parents, we're in a particularly good position to play that role for them to start, whether or not there's a therapist involved.
And another question is, how can I help a child who is resistant to go to therapy or try any form of mindfulness, deep breathing exercise?
Yeah, this is a challenge. This is a challenge for sure, because we get our fair share of kids who just they don't want to do this. And what I'll say is the good news is that, most of us who work with kids and teens, we like this. And so we're pretty good with them. We're pretty good at making connections with them. And that's really what it's about in the beginning, is actually, you know this, Gabrielle, we develop rapport and create a therapeutic alliance, right? And we do that often by starting off with low demands for them. Our job is to help them feel safe and comfortable to start, so that they'll be willing to engage in this process. But I think this question is about, before that, this kid doesn't want to go to therapy, period. I think in general, with kids who are resistant, you probably don't want to do telehealth. You might be able to evolve to that, but in our experience, it's hard to get that engagement if there's not some motivation on the part of the kid. Another thing that parents can do is, talk with the therapist first, like I described in that sequence that we use. We talk with the parents first, and we kind of work as a team. We're like, well, how can we encourage the child? And sometimes it's simple, like if we realize that, well, the parents they really could put their foot down here. And so maybe it's time for them to insist. That doesn't always put you in a great starting position with the kid, but sometimes, especially in middle school, we still have a tremendous influence over our kids, and we should still have tremendous authority over them as well, even though we're encouraging some of their age-appropriate independence and individuation. And sometimes when it's hard to get the kid in, that's indicative of some role reversal or role confusion in terms of the power structure in the family. I think kids do best, even middle schoolers, kids do best when they know that parents are in charge. Parents are kindly in charge, but still in charge. So sometimes, when I've encountered that, sometimes I'll actually spend several sessions with the parents, helping them make some changes in the family structure over time, so that parents again feel like they're the ones in charge and can have more influence. find more ways, come at the child from a perspective of empowerment and not just pleading with the child to get in the door. And also, there's other specific things where, you may just tell the child that, like, all right, let's just try this once, see how it feels. If it doesn't work, maybe we'll postpone. Because a lot of times kids have these preconceived notions. So do adults, by the way, preconceived notions about, the therapist is just going to lecture me. The therapist is going to be super lame. It's going to be, an old dude who doesn't understand me. So sometimes just getting in the door is good enough to get the process started.
I want to ask, earlier you said that this let me see. You mentioned that anxiety can turn into something useful. And I think you roughly say, and I add on to it, is, if performance is coming and the child really doesn't want to practice, what can the parents concretely do or say to encourage to turn that anxiety into something productive?
Yeah. I think this is similar to all, because one of the through lines for this presentation is that parents can teach their kids some of these things. And just to clarify, did you say like a performance is coming up in this example?
Yeah, a performance is going to come up and they better, practice, but something that somehow they avoided the practice.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. One is if the child is stifled and avoiding doing stuff because of anxiety, well, one of the things a parent can do, theoretically, this isn't going to work for all kids, but kind of hold their feet to the fire, or, communicate those expectations that you need to practice. And going along with that, potentially scaffold their practice process, meaning sitting with them to get started, or creating a schedule with them and communicating those expectations that they have to do this. Now, I don't think that's going to work for everybody. I think often, because I work with so many different kinds of folks, different cultures, different ages, different genders, I often like to present a continuum and help parents think about, well, what do you think is going to work? You know your kid better than I do, especially in the beginning. And you can sort of, one end of the continuum is letting them fail, letting them have the experience, especially if they're not anxious about it, they're just not interested and not motivated. Letting them have the experience of doing poorly so that they get a felt experience that this is what happens when you don't prepare. This is what happens when you don't work towards that. And that's one end of the continuum. The other end of the continuum is to really actively be involved in motivating them, again, communicating those expectations or using some sort of even a reward system. My inclination with all this stuff is usually somewhere in the middle, but it's based on the parents reflecting, why do they think, and maybe dialoguing with the kid, why do they think the child isn't putting forth this effort? If it's anxiety related, then helping the child, being curious about maybe some of those cognitive errors that they might be engaging in, being curious about, like, well, what actually happens in the child's body when they start to think about, the performance. Do they start to get anxious? Do they start to get nervous? Because if it is anxiety and they're getting all these signals in their body that they're responding to by kind of trying to shut down and not think of it and just avoid it, they probably do need some active help to engage it kind of more head on. And that might be breathing exercises. It might be exercising together. It might be making a plan together, and so that they're building up resilience rather than building up vulnerability.
Now I'm aware of the time. I would there's more question to ask, and I would like to ask one more question before we close. How do you help a sensitive child without having them close up or be really negative about themselves? Especially in middle school when there's a lot of peer pressure.
Yeah. Well, I think it is in some ways a special case. I think this is a sensitive developmental period in general. Middle school is this, pre-adolescent and early adolescent period. So one thing is to go slow, and build up towards a more robust dialogue. And so sometimes kids will just, sensitive kids, this is the thing, when you have a sensitive constitution, meaning you're emotionally sensitive or you're sensorily sensitive, and you get overwhelmed easily because your sort of awareness is more acute but more raw, then what they will often do, their kind of default and their primary coping mechanism is to just shut it down. Just shut it down. I need less input from you. I need less input from the environment immediately. So what I think with them, the key thing is to help them create a little space between feeling overwhelmed and then shutting off. And so this happens over time with repetition, things that I've done in the therapy session when kids are shutting down that actually can be repeated at home is, giving kids a way to communicate without words, giving kids or without sounds. For example, I've had kids, write to me. I've had kids draw for me. And there's something about turning the volume down on the sensory experience that can make sensitive kids feel a lot safer to share what they feel, which is usually a lot. But with sensitive kids, you also want to be considering that they're going to be potentially more reactive to your advice, you giving advice, potentially more reactive to your judgment, and potentially more reactive to the frequency with which you ask them about their inner life. So go slow, look for the right opportunities, help them, know that you're helping them develop something that is not inborn, it's not innate in them. And that's when you can start to have an influence over their negative thinking. I think too often, and understandably so, I've done this myself before plenty of times as a parent, too often we jump to the solution. We're like, and we can identify like, oh, you're being unfair to yourself. Like, why are you so self-critical? And it evokes worry, and it evokes us going into problem-solving mode. But one of the things that you learn as a therapist right away is that human beings do a lot better when they feel like there's a place to be heard. And that doesn't only have to be the therapy room. That can also be in the child-parent relationship. But it is to get to that point where you're having positive influence, or I should say you have a good sense of influence, and your child is letting you be an occasional emotional coach. You do have to build up to that.
I really thank you very much for your time and all your wonderful parenting tips. If we want to learn more about parenting tips from you, where can we find you?
Well, the first place I would direct you all is to our YouTube channel, and it's on the resource list that I put. I think I put a link to our YouTube channel. There was a time, and I hope to get back to this before the end of the year, where I would do I called it a 1 Minute Monday. So it was about a minute long video talking about how to help your kid shrink their anxiety, how to get them to talk with you more easily, and how to have fun together as a family. You know, things like that, things that that parents ask me and the other therapists hear about like every week. And then we have some longer content too. We have a webinar on mindfulness. We have a webinar on yoga therapy for depression. And we're planning to build out that video content that's free and parents can access. We have a specialty in our clinic here. We don't only do this, but we have a specialty in adolescent and young adult substance abuse treatment. And we're building out that part of our clinic. But, you know, right now we're mostly focused on just general outpatient for youth and young adults and families as well. So that includes kids who have anxiety, kids who have ADHD, teenagers with depression, and that sort of thing. But our biggest online presence right now is on YouTube, and we hope to build more.
What is your YouTube link?
It's, what is it? It's YouTube. It's youtube.com/FamilySpring/featured. I believe that's what it is.
Okay. And also for all of you, this presentation will be made available at the St. Raymond's website, St. Raymond in Menlo Park, and also will be made available at Dr. Mica's website. And also, I hope that remember to do the evaluation if you can. It's in the top of the chat room. I thank you very much for your time.
Of course, it's been my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. Glad to speak with you all today. I hope that you got something out of this. I will say one very last thing, which is that it's awesome that you came here and dedicated this time to yourself and to your kid, to your family. And what matters most is what you do now. I've given you a little worksheet to help you with that, to try and put some of this into practice. But, you know, action is the enemy of anxiety. So I encourage you to take action, you know, and build a partnership, build a collaboration with your kid so that you can start to make some headway with any anxious tendencies that they're showing.
Thank you. And John just put the YouTube link and also St. Raymond link into the chat room. I thank you very much. And I hope that someday you'll come back and share with us some of more of your insights regarding, you know, working with children and parents. Yeah,
I'd be happy to.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope that you will come back and visit the video again. Bye-bye.
Take care.